Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Lane Norton, Assistant Dean for Advancement in the Maxwell School, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this virtual alumni panel discussion exploring issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Before we begin our conversation, we recognize with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. We also acknowledge and support those struggling against institutional racism and structural violence, and are working toward a better future today. Today's engagement continues virtual programming from the Maxwell School to engage our faculty, alumni, and friends on important topics of the day. We are recording this event and will post the recording on the Maxwell YouTube channel so that members of the Maxwell community who could not join us can still watch it as well. We are pleased to provide closed captioning during our program. If you would like to view closed captions, click the CC button in the toolbar. We would like to thank our transcriptionist for her services today. Later in the program, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. To do so, please click the chat icon at the bottom of your screen to enable the chat window, and we will ask your questions for you. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the Maxwell School, David Van Slyke. Dean Van Slyke is the Louis A. Bantle Chair in Business Government, a tenured full professor of the Maxwell School and the College of Arts and Sciences, and a two-time recipient of the Burkhead Award and Professorship for Teaching Excellence. He's a leading international expert on public-private partnerships, public sector contracting and contract management, public and nonprofit management, and policy implementation. Dean Van Slyke serves as Director and Fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and is a member of the organization's expert advisory team for the Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Homeland Security. He's also engaged in the network of schools of public policy, affairs, and administration, the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs, and the University Leadership Council on Diversity and Inclusion in International Affairs Education. Dean Van Slyke, it's my pleasure to hand over our program to you.
Thank you so much, Lane, and welcome everyone. I'm honored to introduce this virtual program, a conversation led by Professor Gladys McCormick, exploring issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're so pleased that so many of you have joined us today for this program. At the Maxwell School, we're fortunate to have incredibly engaged alumni working across levels of government in different industries and sectors, and in the US and around the globe. Several of them have joined us today to lead us in a conversation that encourages constructive dialogue and supports future action and change in support of a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive society. This year has been a hard and challenging year, exhausting and filled with bigotry and hate. Programs like the one we're about to hear and participate in is an opportunity to listen, to understand, to help us remain committed to being an anti-racist institution and to find opportunities to be in coalition with one another. Our program moderator will be Dr. Gladys McCormick. Gladys serves as the J. and Debbie Moskowitz Endowed Chair in Mexico-U.S. Relations, and she's an Associate Professor of History at the Maxwell School. Professor McCormick also serves as the school's Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. She is one of the co-founders of Maxwell's Faculty of Color Group and is deeply passionate and knowledgeable about these issues. We are also thankful to have 4 outstanding Maxwell alumni joining us in our conversation today. First, let me introduce Wes Diaz. Wes earned his bachelor's degree in political science in 1974. He served as co-founder and CEO and president of the Argosy Consulting Group and received Syracuse University's Orange Circle Award, recognizing extraordinary service and philanthropy in 2009. Lisa Gordon is a 1990 MPA alumna of Maxwell, who currently serves as president and CEO of Atlanta Habitat for Humanity, one of the top 10 Habitat for Humanity international affiliates in the United States. She received the university's Orange Circle Award in 2020. Kishana Soldier is a professor of history and Mellon Fellow at Sarah Lawrence College, and her research explores Black presence in Paris. After earning her master's in history in 2019 from Maxwell, she became the first African-American woman to receive her doctorate in history from Syracuse University. And James Willey, a 1998 MPA alumnus who serves as the branch chief in the Health Resources and Services Administration at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He manages the Policy and Special Initiatives Branch, the primary federal agency for improving access to healthcare in the United States. Gladys, Wes, Lisa, Kishana, and James, thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation. And Gladys, I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. Thank you to everybody who's attending today. And as many of you will remember, this is actually revisiting a series of panels that we did last June. And almost a year ago, we convened most of the panelists that we have here, with the exception of Kishana, who's new to the panel, to discuss what was going on in the US at that time. George Floyd had recently been killed. The Black Lives Matter movement was just getting started. So in many ways, we're kind of coming back full circle and sort of taking up that moment yet again to see where we're at today. I want to just quickly pause and thank all the individuals who were here back then and who are here again today, in part because I had just assumed the position of Director of DEI here for Maxwell. And that series of panels was so provocative and so engaging and so thoughtful that I soon after sat down, I immediately began composing Maxwell's strategic plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you for that. All right, so let's recognize that this workshop or this panel could have been dramatically different based on what happened this past Tuesday. I feel that this past Tuesday with the Chauvin verdict, we all collectively let out a sigh of relief. And at the same time, there was that sort of celebration, that moment of like just letting go, but then sort of recognizing how much more work we still have to do. So I want to sort of put that on the table, in part because I'm sure it's going to color everybody's comments today. I'm going to begin with a question, and I'm going to ask our panelists to go in the following order as they sort of contemplate what their responses are. Wes, Lisa, Kishana, and James. And the first question for all panelists is, during the last year, our country has witnessed repeated acts of racial injustice and violence at the hands of law enforcement, which we just recently revisited this past week in the trial of Derek Chauvin for the killing of George Floyd. Looking back at the events over the past year, how have these acts of racism and violence and the ensuing mobilization and protest impacted our view of race relations and or the undoing of systemic racism in the United States? That's a very big question. I've asked the panelists to reflect on this question over the last few days, and I've also asked them to please feel free to draw on their professional or their personal experiences when answering. So Wes, can you take it? Hi, Wes. I think you're muted.
Okay,
There.
yeah, I was muted.
Yeah.
At first I was muted by the host, but it looked like I was there. But yes, both in the context of having been on the panel last year and what has transpired, and I'm glad to be here because the discussions themselves will provide an opportunity for people to have their individualized thoughts. And each individual is going to bring their behavior to align with how they feel about things happening. So I felt really good for the Floyd family as a microcosm of a Black family having experienced extraordinary injustice. I personally wasn't happy with the decision because for me it was meaningless. The system itself is completely unchanged as a result of that decision. The training and mentality and the narrative of law enforcement in the US completely unchanged. There are actually police labor unions that have agreements with their respective municipalities where the level of accountability that we saw for Chauvin is simply agreed to be off the table. So those kinds of things will not be impacted in any way by this decision. So hopefully people will be further motivated as they look at the context. This is the first instance, if you will, of the blue wall cracking in any meaningful way. Well, that tells you a lot about the depth of the institution that we're going to have to, at a minimum, have major changes to. And many will say that the institution itself is irreparable. But for me, I was glad to see for the family some level of relief. Having seen other people that I know personally, their families experiencing unjust incarceration, lost opportunities because of that. So yeah, I'm glad for them individually, but it doesn't change my view of things institutionally at all.
Okay, thank you, Wes. Lisa, do you want to go next? I think you're muted, Lisa. There.
Yeah, it was giving me an issue. But anyway, thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective today with this panel. And thank you for all the work that Dean Van Slyke you're doing and Dr. McCormick that you're doing. We appreciate it. I will say a few things. One, I think it affected me when I looked at the verdict. It affected me on multiple levels. One, it was a relief to see that justice was going to be served where it was obvious an excessive use of force, and George Floyd did not have to die if it had been handled differently. So I think in that case, it felt like relief. But to Wes's point, I think the structural issues that allowed that to happen, which are multiple, including, the area that I work in, housing, housing discrimination and segregation happens throughout our country economically, and it creates those structures where even the police don't want to go into certain neighborhoods, or where people in one neighborhood are treated one way and in another neighborhood it's treated somewhere else. I think on the individual level, people started to question just that thought of the police are always right. So in the past, the awareness, so I feel like the awareness has been raised to ask the questions and to really have a process that allows you to get to the truth versus, kind of the rush to judgment that the victim is always somehow at fault, even no matter how egregious the violence against them may be. I think as it relates to our organization, it allowed us to pause and have some conversations that our organization hasn't had it in an intentional way. And I'm a member of several national organizations, and also was involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations that were very intentional about how do we break the structure that creates this issue and allows it to perpetuate. And I think one area that probably James will address is, the federal policy of funding for police over the last 10 to 15 years has created kind of the militarization of the police force. Instead of like neighborhood community policing, the number of police in communities has increased through the COPS funding. And I think the same amount of money could be invested in restructuring how we provide those services and how we support communities and how we address real issues of crime, because there is crime and there is work that's happening. So how do you strike that balance of good police and law enforcement practices, and then really having a very swift and significant way to deal with people that violate those policies. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I certainly think just the level of awareness and the conversations, even Maxwell having this conversation 3 or 4 times with the same group, just shows you what the impact is.
Thank you. How about Kashana?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I guess I'm a newbie to this group, so it's wonderful to be part of the group. And I'll be centering my comments really based upon my experience as a historian and the work that I'm doing at Sarah Lawrence College, but also within Yonkers. So this entire year has caused a lot of reflection, I think, for both scholars, but especially historians, in understanding really the roots of how we got here and the path forward. So I would say that systematic racism, injustice, and violence at the hands of law enforcement find its roots in the legacies of slavery. The failure of America's radical reconstruction in the wake of the Civil War really led to the re-enslavement of African Americans from the end of the Civil War to World War II, but some scholars would argue to the present. And that really facilitated this criminalization of Black life in a variety of ways through the use of, for example, Black codes, debt peonage, and forced labor, and more specifically, redlining and other facets of Black life. So these acts of racial injustice, discrimination, violence at the hands of law enforcement have not increased in their frequency or impact on Black communities. Instead, police and violence have been a consistent feature of Black life in America. What has changed is the frequency and impact that the United States and the world is now seeing on Black communities. So it's captured in real time through the use of smartphones and social media and then shared. And I believe that's really what's pushing the needle of change is this awareness, this really forced reconciliation between social media and the realization that people are experiencing these moments of awareness at different paces, especially through the saturation of this violence on traditional and new media platforms. So everything from Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to TV, and even film, you're seeing violence on Black communities on a daily basis, if not hourly or momentarily, if you're on social media that frequently, which is common within sort of my generation. And I would say that police brutality, unfortunately, is only one facet of undoing systematic racism in America. You know, you have redlining in housing, you have economic mobility and the lack of representation in C-suites, you have education, the lack thereof, you have food deserts. And these are all pieces of the puzzle. So I do want to stress that despite sort of this focus on the Derek Chauvin verdict, there are other pieces that are a part of this undoing of systematic racism in America. So in the process of strategizing, protesting, and building movements and organizations to dismantle the vestiges of systematic racism, people are linking, you know, their individual protest efforts to a more holistic vision of what the United States could be. And I'm looking forward to discussing a bit more about what that vision could be. But I sort of want to close my remarks with thinking about, you know, 1 year after a Gallup poll found that 2/3 of Americans found an unfavorable opinion of him, and at the height of his vocal opposition to the Vietnam War, Dr. King asked, where do we go from here? And I think 54 years later, especially with the verdict so fresh on our minds, we're asking the same question. The verdict in the case and trial of Derek Chauvin is indeed a historical turning point, I think, in the journey of justice, equity, and livelihood for Black Americans. But it's critical, I think, to link this momentum of change to a broader system. I think to Lisa's point, that still is needed to be deconstructed. And I want to close by saying, you know, my thoughts and prayers are with the family of George Floyd, because while this verdict is historical and it has brought some relief, it hasn't, I think, to Wes's point, dismantled, I think, the systems that are in place, nor does it bring him back. And I can't understate that enough, nor did it impact the passing of a 15-year-old, Ma'Khia Bryant, who was murdered by police and shot 4 times, literally 15 minutes after that verdict was announced, or Andrew Brown Jr., an unarmed Black man in North Carolina that was shot on Wednesday. So that verdict clearly has not really pushed the pendulum change all that much. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Kishana. James, do you want to take it up?
Sure. Well, first, just thank you for hosting this and inviting me. And also, just as a disclosure, I'm speaking on my personal views and not on behalf of my employer. But in terms of just looking at this, it has been, this past year has been, I think, raising the voice of many people, and are people finally getting listened to. That it's been something that has been brewing for a long time, you know, many decades, and it's finally in the light of day because of, as Lisa pointed out, I think cell phones, or being able to point to actually show these pictures and say this was not me, you know, us versus them, or any kind of thing going on like that. That it's not documented someplace. So part of it is, yes, this is, in this past year, it has been raising the kind of the temperature on this issue, and actually bringing it to the light of many people who never thought it was existing. And once that happens, then now it's kind of, now what? Now that we've gotten to this point, and now that we've had protests in the street, and we've had a lot of people pouring out, and people from other backgrounds also saying, yeah, this isn't right. What is this? What happens next? And that's the big thing that's going to happen I think this summer, is that we either move forward, or all of a sudden it gets retrenched, or we end up with hey, you had a victory on Tuesday, so therefore we can move on. It was the same when, for example, when Obama got elected, all of a sudden it's a non-racial society. You're like, yeah, no. And that was the thing, and then we've learned since then how crazy it still is. And it's one of those things that I think people haven't been either. It's easy not to pay attention to it. And I think one of the things that also happened this last year is that we're in a pandemic and so many people are at home. You're not commuting. You're not necessarily in a position where you just kind of put your head down. So you're staring at a screen for a lot of hours a day. And in doing that, all of a sudden you're like, whoa, there's this video. Oh my gosh, there's another video, or there's something else going on over here. Or there's this protest happening, which the media said it was only a blip here, but it was hundreds of thousands of people. And that's the kind of thing all of a sudden now we're all being kind of looking at and saying like, oh, wait, there's something going on here. And it isn't just something of it's happening in those cities or it's happening in those areas or it's those people, that it's actually something where people are looking at and saying like, what happened here? How did that? I watched this video and I saw nothing wrong, and yet somebody is dead now at the end of it. And that's the kind of thing where people look at and they're just like, I don't understand. And now I'm actually being forced to witness things that have been going on for years, but have never been put in people's faces, and that they never had to react to and say, okay, I stand with these people or I stand against that practice. And that's one of the things that I think people are kind of coming to terms with, of being just having to take a position of which side are you on? Do you recognize that this person was murdered? And if that's the case, then something has to happen. And now people are getting to the point of recognizing it, but I don't think they are necessarily, now what do we do about it? What's the action that needs to happen, or the things that need to be dismantled or changed to prevent that in the future?
Thanks, James. I appreciate it. And I gotta be honest with you. I think I especially like the part where you just said, yeah, no. So very well put. Okay, so we're going to move on to our second question. And what we did is that we asked the panelists to reflect on one of two questions. So the two questions are, the first one is, what are your thoughts on the role, impact, and importance of public service in academia during this time? And then the second one is, can you reflect on any specific challenges you have overcome during this time, or situations where obstacles have become opportunities? And I just want to remind you again that we have many in the audience who are students and alumni of color. So this is an opportunity to share with them any advice or guidance you wish you had heard as a student yourself. So we're going to go ahead and circle back at the beginning and start with Wes.
Okay. That was a really interesting question when I first read it. And so part of it, my answer ties back to the whole institutional racism that we're confronting. And if you think about the challenge is of allowing each individual to reclaim their humanity. African-American people have been dehumanized. And that dehumanization was something that was then used to fuel the intentional construction of the systems that we see today. Some of these systems are anti-Black systems. So we're not talking about random acts of discrimination. We're talking about the intentional devising of processes to do harm to African-American people. Countless examples. One of my favorite examples on the federal level is the United States federal government is the largest customer in the world. And in 1934, they created a federally owned company that in 1977 became called Unicor. In 1934, it was the Federal Prison Industries. Well, Unicor is a mandatory source for government procurement. If you're a government procurement official, that's one of the areas you have to look at before you even go to open market. So you begin to see the incentive to incarcerate people, because the same people that are in prison could be servicing you on a call center for Visa. They could be, at one point, 80% of the limos in the US were constructed by Unicorn, right? So you've got these systems in place where people are being victimized intentionally. So with that being said, I always encourage young people I'm talking to, but also my peers, because the struggle so far has never ended, regardless of your age. And my thing is, take back your own humanity. You don't allow other people who are hostile to you to define who you are as a person. And so you take it back on your own terms. You define yourself, you validate yourself, and that gives you fuel to contend with the micro and overt aggressions. And they will be many. And as you move further up in your career, there seems to be a inverse proportion of that intense hatred for you. So about a year ago, I was actually confronted, having been in a work situation, and I'm deliberately being vague because I don't want to have to fight that battle. But all of our communications had been by email, so no one saw anyone. And it was about 8 people, very well educated, very well connected. Everybody was very successful. Hooray, hooray. And at some point, one of the individuals came to find me, and I happened to be in a rather secured environment. And secured meaning you had to have a badge to get in the building, you have to have a badge to get in the elevator and all of that. And when they knocked on my door, which was partially open, and I got up to push it all the way open because they weren't coming in, this person screams at me that you are not Wes Diaz. And I looked at the person and I could feel the animus. I mean, the hatred was extraordinary. And I smiled at them actually, and I said, yes, I am. And the person repeated it, leaned back to see the name on the door, and with greater intensity, couldn't process it. So I said, yes, I am. Well, then they figured, oh, you're an imposter, a liar. And they proceeded to speak as if they were going to test me, right? Because you can't possibly be this person. And after the second word of their 2-sentence test, I knew exactly who the person was. And so I let them finish, and then I proceeded to, in great detail, continue the conversation, and they were completely deflated. Now, we only ended up speaking for about 2 more minutes, and they didn't speak again. They left, and there was never an apology or a change. There was never an acknowledgement that I was who I was. But it was difficult for them to process my office, the connections I had provided during the course of our 6 weeks, the added value. That person could not imagine that a Black man could be doing that. So you have to, personally, I didn't take it personal. I mean, it was rather interesting that an individual would be at that place in 2020, but that's where they were. So again, that's an example to the soon-to-be alum. You don't allow that person to somehow denigrate you. You don't empower them. The opinion of that individual didn't change my view of myself. And so I was able to continue on not only with the rest of the day, but with the next 14 months, and I'll continue on without it. But it is noteworthy because everybody is not going to be in a place where they can withstand too many of those onslaughts, right? I mean, and that's the key. So define yourself, take back your humanity, and don't take it personally.
Wes, thanks for sharing that. That was unbelievably powerful. Thank you.
Wow. And I just was saying, wow. Thank you, Wes, for sharing that story. I think what I would say is, one of the challenges that I've had is, to Wes's point, I am, very established in my career, and it's not just in my local organization, but probably on a state level and a national level. So I'm a member of organizations, and in many of those organizations, even in 2021, I'm the only Black woman in the room. And so, I'm a member because I'm in housing. I'm also in commercial real estate, and more recently on a few national boards. And literally, a few people on staff have said to me they don't remember any other person that looks like me being in the position. And these people have been working for the organization for 10 or 15 years. And they said, "Are you the first?" I said, "I don't know." But the fact that they have no recollection of even interacting with another African American or Black woman, whichever term you use, um, in 10 to 15 years in an organization that serves, the all communities, was just incredible to me. And it wasn't until we started having the conversations on the DE&I when I was invited to attend some of the national um, level activities. And so there was this awareness that, oh, there's no one in the room that is, representative of all of our members. Let me just say it that way, of all of our members. And then I think the same thing with locally. I'll just give this example. In my own organization, when everything happened, we were asked to make a statement, and my team came to me and said, "Are you going to make a statement?" I said, "Yeah, I'll make a statement." And I wanted to make a balanced statement about, what can we do to work together, but how we have to stand up against injustice. And so I would just say my statement it wasn't, you know, burn the building down, and it wasn't, there's not really a problem. So it was a good, strong statement, but it wasn't on either of the extremes. And so someone on my staff, a senior team member, sent me an email that said, "Well, we know you gave a statement, but we think you should give a statement that looks like these other three organizations." And they gave me their statements, and they told me who did it. And so because I'm in the meetings with the different groups and I know about these organizations, then I went and I sent my team member a list of all of those organizations and the composition of their boards, their executive teams, and their organizations. And one of the organizations did not have any people of color in it, but they had the strongest statement of everyone. And then the other two examples, they all had these really strong examples of their standing up with Black Lives Matter, they're making a stand and a statement, but their actions were void of any real commitment to what was in their letter. And so I pointed out to the person that those organizations need to make that kind of statement because they haven't been engaged, they haven't done the work, and they're just beginning the conversation. And those statements are what their PR firms put together because somebody looked at around their organization and says, "You know what, we've done nothing on this issue." And so I said back to the person, when you look at our organization, we have diversity on our executive team, we have diversity on our board, we serve a diverse population, and we're doing the work every day to break down, systemic barriers around racism, specifically in housing. So I felt like I didn't need to make that statement that they needed to make. They needed to make the statement and then they needed to do the work, but we're doing the work. And I think that was one of the things I will say is you just have to own your own voice, and you can't be influenced around what other people think you should say and do in response to what is happening in the world, because your journey and experience is different, but you have to understand the values. But there was a lot of "you should do." So I would say to the students on the call, this just know who you are and where you stand, and everybody's going to come to things at a different place. But my focus has always been and will continue to be about meaningful change. I want to see meaningful change. It doesn't impress me because you made a statement, and it doesn't impress me because you hired, one or two people that are going to focus on this issue. It impresses me when your values are reflected in every aspect of your culture and the way your organization operates. And I will add, for the academia, I think that's where academia is falling short. The vision and the words are good, but on the ground, the alignment of real diversity, whether it's students or faculty or perspectives, is missing.
Thank you, Lisa. It would be fascinating to be able to go back and see 1 year later where those organizations that put out those strong statements are at today, right? All right, Kashana.
Sure, I'd love to pick up where Lisa left off, talking about academia, since that's the world that I live and breathe in. For me, public service and academia are inextricably linked. And I began my journey as a scholar and a Black woman with the intention to balance both. I think those who know me know I was really intentional about bringing those two worlds together because I feel education is just one piece of the puzzle, especially since most people believe education is learning. And I think one of the ways that academia can continue to expand and create more space is unlearning certain practices. I think that oftentimes we consider ourselves sort of scholars and experts, but a huge part of that, especially in practice, is unlearning systems, understandings, or dismantling things that are not actually creating or impacting change. And universities can leverage both their educational expertise, research, and service various mandates by engaging in other institutions beyond themselves. Oftentimes universities and colleges are really focused on what they're doing on the ground and not in ways to build connections or facilitate collaborations. And I think that's key to Lisa's point, that's moving beyond writing and research to action, is actually engaging with institutions or groups that are grassroots, that are on the ground, that actually have connections with organizations that are not leaving. One of the things that I've seen in a lot of work is that there's vacuums that are created with 1 year or 2 year postdocs, or with visiting professorships, or with fellowships that are for 1 or 2 years. And after those individuals leave, there's a vacuum, and that work literally becomes sort of a stalemate. So connecting academia to the public sector by activities such as capacity building or public engagement, creating these new partnerships, but also addressing inequities in hiring, in retention, in enrollment are really key, I think, to moving beyond just saying you're doing the work or posting on social media and actually getting involved with community engagement. And I think the Maxwell School has a really unique opportunity to lend its talent and knowledge and expertise to things like policy making, both the creation of new policies, but dismantling really destructive and violent policies, also lobbying and activism that students now can get involved with. And that impact can be national. I think it can change the direction that America is headed. And there's a variety of ways to get involved. So speaking personally, in my own work, I've seen students transformed when they're not just turning in a paper for a grade and actually getting hands-on experience doing that research. So one of the ways that I do that in my own work is right now I'm working with students focusing on communities in Yonkers, New York, and dealing with the legacy of the desegregation case that ended, believe it or not, in 2007. So the work clearly still is there to do. So I'm having students actually collaborate with different organizations in the city and work there, both as interns, but also produce pieces, whether that's workshops, whether that's podcasting or panels that bridge the college, Sarah Lawrence College, also with community organizations. I think that's the next step in that process. So taking all of that knowledge and work and bringing together communities that traditionally don't speak to each other is critical. And my advice to students is, and I think that builds on what Lisa and Wes is saying, is that you may be the first, like myself, like Lisa, or you may be the only, like Wes, but I think being intentional about not remaining the first and only is so important. I think in these roles, you have the opportunity to expand opportunities, to welcome new people into boards or organizations. And that's where the real change is. I think, holding on to these positions can be solitary, but if you do have the opportunity to welcome other people into the group, that's really what keeps the process moving, but also new voices that traditionally have been silenced is what I would say.
Thank you, Kashana. James?
Well, ditto. Everything that the three of them said. The big thing I think is for me, realizing that one, you're not alone. That as you go into what any person of color does when you walk into a room is you identify your allies, and you immediately look around the room and you count how many people of color are there because they have your back. Sometimes they don't, but that's at least a superficial look you do. Anytime you walk into a room, that's no matter where you are, whether you're going to an advisory board meeting, whether you're going to lunch, whether you're walking into just a conference room. This is what happens. This is what people of color do when you are the only ones in the room, when you are the token. And you have to have tokens because you got to break the ceiling somehow. And unfortunately, as Kishana pointed out, oftentimes what it happens is we'll have the 2-year term. And one of the things that has happened in the federal government is they've really pushed down on having term appointments, which are 1 or 2 years, because oftentimes that was the way we could diversify without really diversifying. And that was the way they've done it in academia, is we'll have the visiting professors who are going to be really cool and bring something immediate to the campus, but it's not long-term. And that's the thing that it's trying to say, we're investing long-term, and we're going to actually give up the coveted positions of these elevating people to positions where there are now examples out there. And it's not just Wes by himself that, which has happened. I mean, he's in the generation where he was by himself. I'm still in a generation where maybe I'm by myself but sometimes there's one other person. And now it's getting a little more, but it's not done. And it's definitely not over. And that's one of the things that also I think has been in play, is that, like, I was listening to just the coverage of police trials. And when they've talked about them, they're like, well, but this is the law. You can't have this. It's like, who wrote the law? And where did that come from? And who wrote the promoting, requirements? And where did that come from? And who wrote the hiring requirements? And where did that come from? And where is that, so when you start to look at the structural part of this, it didn't happen one day. And it didn't happen with somebody just coming in saying, I'm going to wipe out all people of color from the senior leadership. But that's something that is, when you look at most organizations, and yes, most across the country, across the world, if you start looking at them, once you get to the higher echelons, you start losing diversity. And that's one of the things to look at, is to say, okay, where are we? What's going on? And there's been a lot of organizations. I mean, I work for government, and I think in government, there's been on the level, because they were required to not have certain hiring requirements, and they got caught doing that too much, that they then started hiring more blind, and you see more diversity in that. But one of the things you don't see is people rising in the levels of leadership there. So you end up with still is, which we refer to when we're casually meeting with other people, is it's the plantation. You have the people on the top, they're homogeneous. You get down to the worker level, and then the managers of the workers might be even integrated. The workers are definitely diverse, but once you get to that leadership and decision-making, it's not. And once you recognize that, and that's where this last year has been a lot of the recognizing of that, now it's, what do you do for that action? And it can't be like, well, we're going to look to hire a new person here. It's got to be, how did we get to this point? What rules were put in place to make sure that we were only going to hire white men, or we were only going to promote people who look like me? That's the kind of thing we need to start looking at. And that's the structural aspect of it, that now it's become comfortable to say, that's just the law. You can't prosecute police because that's the law. And you're like, who wrote the law, and what was the law written for? And it was written for a particular thing to happen. And it's happened to the point where we have people coming out. And the reality now is we have all colors of policemen coming out saying, the law says I have to put my knee here. And that's the crazy part, where you're like, so this person can't be prosecuted because we wrote a law telling them this is how you keep a community down, or this is how you promote the same areas. We don't want diversity happening in a big way. We want it to trickle in, and we'll control it. So that's one of the things that's out there as well, is that people, the other part is, if you look at this by yourself, you can get demoralized and frustrated. That's why you definitely need to connect with people, joining groups, just to be communing with other people, to keep a contact list, of learning to self-empower yourself by, I have my own contact list of people who I can talk to and say, reality check, am I crazy? Or when someone made this joke and I was like, yeah, it's kind of offensive, And everyone looked at me. I felt like, oh, that was stupid. You're like, was that stupid? No. My gosh, you had to say something because it was totally inappropriate. But that's the kind of thing we don't have now, is that oftentimes you're put in a position that you're the one. And it always happens. And again, in terms of people of color, if you're a person of color who's on the faculty at a university, every student of color wants you as their advisor. So it's not just that you are the person, you're breaking the ceiling, you have a position there, but you also end up with the position. And again, it's with anyone who gets elevated. Now, can you help make sure that all these people of color are happy? You're like, I'm doing my job and I'm supposed to take care of everyone over here. And if we don't recognize that we've added this burden to everybody by saying, if you want to take on this position as being a person of color in an authority position, you are going to also have to take care of all the complaints, be the ear for everyone who's like, this is unfair, the system's not working. And if you don't recognize the fact that, and oftentimes we push people into that position, then it's also setting them up of like, yeah, I'm going to get burned out, I'll be frustrated. But it is trying to figure out, how do we keep now backfilling and bringing people up and letting people know there are avenues and pathways to leadership positions. And that's right now, it's still, we're now in the wow, it looks like something's not fair here. Now what? And that's really starting to look at, how do we dismantle or make sure that we don't keep the same situation going.
Thanks, James. I appreciate it. So we don't have that long left. And I feel that in many ways, all of you have already answered the final question, which is, what questions are we not asking? And I think the four of you really did put that there already. So I want to go ahead and let the audience chime in. And I'd ask please to go, if you could please put any questions or comments that you'd like our panel to reflect on in the chat. And then that will be relayed to us. So type your questions and we'll go ahead and put it out. As we get folks' questions, I do want to say, revisiting this 1 year late, or almost 1 year later. So Kishana has always been very upfront with all of this. I'm not at all surprised, but I think for James, for Lisa, and for Wes, there's a certain openness with your comments that perhaps a year ago, people were still so raw, in part because George Floyd had just recently been killed. So I just want to appreciate your candor and your openness in terms of putting out there so much for us to reflect on. So thank you. And I'm not sure if it'll come up in some of the questions. Yes. So there's a lot of thank yous that are emerging in the chat, which is just wonderful. But if some of the questions aren't being prompted, something that's different from what was happening last year is that when we spoke in June, COVID was just kind of getting going, right? So we didn't necessarily know at that point how much it was affecting populations of color and peoples of color. And now we do. And I think, for the most part, these two things have been sort of studied side by side in parallel with each other. So I'm just wondering if perhaps if we have a chance to sort of get you to sort of insert COVID and the effects of COVID on populations of color here in the US as one thing. Another question, and I want to actually sort of make mention of the fact that we have a number of folks on this phone call that are abroad. So for example, I see Javier Font, who I believe is in Spain. And I just want to recognize that something that wasn't clear to us a year ago was the impact of Black Lives Matter and sort of the mobilizations that ensued over the course of that summer. And not only in terms of the US, but more broadly speaking, abroad, in part because it's really opened up a language of systemic racism elsewhere in countries that weren't allowed to actually have that sort of discourse. It's given them sort of the tools and again, the words by which to sort of express racism more globally. So I wanted to sort of put that out there. So let me just quickly see. So everybody likes it, which is wonderful. So Kyara is asking a question, which is that she would really like to hear how you all have addressed that added, quote, burden that you face in your higher ups outside of your job description, and how to hold them accountable. So in other words, how do you sort of actually take on invisible labor and get folks to sort of recognize the burdens of invisible labor? Who wants to take that one on?
I'll take a shot at it. Although to me, part of the process is each individual should have wellness as their primary focus each and every day. You need to make sure you get adequate sleep, you eat correctly. If you feel ill, take care of that, right? Drink enough water and the rest. Meditate, practice martial arts, whatever it may be, because you need to be fit for yourself and for those that you want to interact with in a meaningful way. And so that leads to the answer is really what James was mentioning. You walk into the room and you are looking for other people of color. The upside of that is you're really looking for a community member. So to me, when I was ever in positions of hiring, and there have been a lot of hiring panels, you have to be careful of not getting burnt out. So I am not a military vet, but I've been on countless panels where different military personnel were hiring other people, right? Civilians. And I was generally the only person of color there, and certainly the only non-military. But I would openly advocate for people of color in terms of candidates, because there was a general mindset, and you have to confront it because it is so fundamental. We've been talking here as if myself, Lisa, James, we're all human beings, but there are many who don't see people here. They see beast. They see someone the way they've seen a bear ride a bicycle in a circus. So those animalistic kinds of terminology and labels is how you evidence, if you will, the dehumanizing of a segment of the population. It's also what justifies people bringing violence to you, because there's not a sense that you need to provide the same human consideration to a George Floyd, because he's walking and talking, but he's an ape, he's a bear, he's some other thing, but he's not a human. And therefore, your sensibilities are different. And until we change that narrative, and this goes to academia, academia is a forum where there's opportunity for dialogues like what we're having right now. It's also a place where research is housed. The archives that are available, especially now with the search engines, extraordinary. Data is being digitized. People are finding pictures. They just found Harriet Tubman's home about 2-3 days ago in Maryland. The technology is bringing forward immense amounts of information that can be used to change the narrative. And so at a level, you balance yourself, and I see community in it. I get excited working with the students and with younger alumni, but also the older alumni like myself. It's a sense of community. It's a community based on our humanity. And so, although I don't take calls late at night, I try not to deal with things in the evening. I try to monitor not doing too much on the weekends, because family is family, but I get thrilled by it. And, this week I talked to a mechanical engineer at Syracuse University, African-American woman, and it was great, right? And she's got some things that I could help her with, and we're moving along. So there's a fuel there. There's a heavyweight burden for sure, but there's a lot that we get back that energizes us to keep us going.
Thank you, Wes. So I know we're getting close to time, but I'm going to keep you guys around for a few minutes longer, if that's okay, just because I would really like to hear this. And then there are some additional questions in the chat that are really valuable. So I understand if some of you may have to go at 4 o'clock, but for the rest of you, if you wouldn't mind sticking around for a few more minutes so we can let our panelists finish, that would be great. So Kishana, Lisa, James, what do you do with invisible labor?
Sure, I'll go. Invisible labor, I think, is a huge part of academia. The things that happen, inside the classroom and the many hours that happen outside. I think some days I lose balance of like, oh, it's Saturday, I shouldn't be working, or oh, it's Sunday and I'm still working. And I would say that it's a practice that I think many of us are still working to balance, is what I would say. But what I do think is valuable is choosing what you say yes and no to. I think that's something that we all can benefit from. I know that there are some, for example, students that I do not mind sacrificing my Saturday for because I believe it's that important for this event or the panel or whatever the project is to be there. But then there are also moments, I think, when because you are quote unquote the only or a woman in faculty or a Black woman in faculty, where you're asked to join certain panels or search committees, or you can say no if it doesn't fit within sort of your work life balance. And I think saying no is something my advisor, I don't know if he's on here, Jeff Gonda mentioned, but I need to get better with it. So I would say that that question is actually a call to action for me personally. But I would say that the reality is there's so much invisible labor, and it's what you believe in that you commit to sacrificing, personal time because it's that important to you. But it's also equally valuable to say no to things that you don't believe in, because then you're co-opted into sort of using elements of your identity to facilitate other programmatic agendas. And I think that's where the real value in saying no is, to only commit to things that you believe in and sacrificing where it's necessary, is what I would say.
Okay. Lisa, James, would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure. I would just say I've always had a term called equilibrium. I strive for equilibrium, which means that in any kind of phase of my life or any day, I look at kind of what's the most important, and I know that I can't balance. I don't do balance, but when I'll give an example, when my children were small, then I made a point of not being overly engaged in a lot of organizations because I was a working mom and we had a family, and I wanted to make sure whatever extra time I had was spent with my kids. But now that my kids are in college, I have the other side. I have tons of time. So there's been things that I've wanted to do that I'm doing now. So I always think about it in terms of, what's that equilibrium? And then when it comes to giving my time to others, it's kind of the same things. Is it aligned with my priorities? And can I really help them? So a lot of people come to me and they want, to mentor with me. And I have people that I mentor with. I have lots of people, but I can't mentor everyone. And so I always try to find out, well, what is it that you need? And a lot of people are looking for career advice and they're looking for professional development. And I'm like, if that's what you're looking for, I try to get them to that resource versus if you're looking for someone who can help you with tough situations as you go through your promotions or you go through the world, then that's to me a little bit more mentoring. It's kind of that lessons learned, experience, things that I can share with you that aren't going to be in textbooks, that are not going to be in coaching, that are not going to help you identify, where do you want to be and what do you want to impact? How do you want to impact the world? So I try to, really think about what does that need for that person? And then I try to also think about, if there's a bunch of people that are trying to get with me, then maybe I just do a Zoom call with 10 of them and ask them to kind of collaborate as a support group with each other. So I also try to think of, how can I serve, by giving back, but how can I also preserve some time for myself? Because you do have to do the self-care. To Wes's point, you have to have time to reflect, and everybody needs some time to just think, that creative space. And I think that's what I always try to find, that equilibrium. So it may look different at different times, but I try to look at it like that. So overall, it may be, it allows me to, to be satisfied with the things I'm doing and not to feel burdened. I mean, because if you think about it, if you're mentoring someone or if you're helping students or you're helping coworkers, you don't want to go to it and you're like, I don't really want to do this because I'm tired. It comes across if that's how you feel about it, whether you think it does or not. So that energy level needs to be there. So when it's time to lead, you really have to step up to the plate and you're like, I'm the leader, I'm going to lead. If I'm going to be your mentor, you're going to do some homework, but you have to be engaged. So I think it's really important to just step back for a moment and really try to identify that for yourself.
Okay. James, do you want to finish up with that one?
Just with what everyone else has said, it's just really, understanding where your boundaries are and not letting yourself be dragged over that. If it means that you have to walk away from something even that you're passionate about because you know that's going to put you over the edge, do that. And particularly when you're dealing with a lot of stuff that just keeps piling on, don't let yourself be brought into something. It might be a really important case, it might be a really important issue, but when you're like, I'm exhausted and I don't have the personal, backup to be able to go in and say, like, you have an issue here, I can deal with that. Being able to, one of the things that does help, I think, is to have allies. And particularly if you're a part of a community or a group, and be able to say, like, let me, Wes is a good person, you can check in with, why don't you go there? And if you can push people off, because oftentimes they only know you as the one person of color or the one person who I know in this authority situation. If you can identify some other people in those situations who they can go to, that is oftentimes also a way of preserving yourself.
Okay, so I appreciate the fact that you've all sort of highlighted that this is sort of a critical role that you play in each one of your different industries, right? So I do want to quickly come to one last question, in part because I feel like it's very timely in terms of kind of coming back to where we started. And Rajan, I hope I pronounced your name right, but Rajan is asking, how do you guys handle white fragility when discussing systemic racism? And she said, they say, I found it one of the biggest impediments to tackling it. If anything, I feel like we're going backwards with all these voter suppression bills. And now states are introducing laws against which seems pretty clearly in response to Black Lives Matter. So in other words, the backlash. So this is sort of a good way in which to kind of return back to this point. When we began a year ago having these conversations, things were still sort of open in terms of understanding where the social movement was going to go. And now we're seeing the reaction, right? And that reaction has led to a lot of backlash. And at least I'm thinking about all the voter suppression laws that are going on in Georgia. So anybody want to speak to that point?
Since you brought up Georgia, I mean, I can chime in and I'll try to be brief because I know we're interested in time. But I think what's been remarkable here is many people recognize the inequity and the disparity in the voting system and in the redistricting that had happened, which has created a majority for many, many years. I mean, it's something like 20, 25 years where only certain candidates get elected, but that's because of how the districting goes. And so there's been a concerted effort to really mobilize people to get out the votes and someone to do that analysis. So someone sat down, and Stacey Abrams, I'm sure you've all heard of her, who I know, and she's just as impressive as you see on TV, her and other people in Georgia, really sat down and did the analysis of what would it take to really start to see some changes. And then in addition to that, a lot of people have moved to this area, moved to different parts of Georgia, and they bring different views. And how do you leverage those folks? So when you do the analysis, I actually was on a call with one of the chambers, and someone did the analysis, and they said one of the issues is, an extra X 100,000 people came from other states in-state migration. And that also impacted, plus to get out the vote, plus really having candidates focus on the issues. I'm sure some of you may have seen the debate where there was also a very strategic focus to make sure people were focusing on the issues and not messages of fear. And so I think all of that happened. And then people said, oh no, it was a mistake. Let's undo all the things that they felt helped, get voters to the polls. And I think we will see, I guess, a lot of opposition to that. But it was a backlash, and it was very intentional, and it was very overt. I mean, the backlash here in Georgia has been very overt. It's like, no, we don't want people voting, so they can't have a drink. You can't give them a drink when they're online. I mean, really? I mean, and I said it was 70 degrees today, and during certain times it could be 90, 100 degrees out here, and they don't have enough precincts. So people have waited in line 4 to 7 hours to vote in Georgia. And this was an early voting. So it took me 2 hours to early vote. And that was 2 weeks before the day of voting. The day of voting, it was in excess of 5 hours at some locations. So I think the transparency around what people are doing, I think, will help impact those things being overturned.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. So Kashana, Wes, James, do you want to sort of address this notion of the backlash before we kind of cede the floor to Dave to close us out?
Sure. I think with the backlash, if folks could just be patient with me for a moment, it's not that you have to be that concerned about the fragility of someone else. The better emphasis is on the rightness of the issue. And yes, people will see things differently, but there are certain things that are rather clear cut. So crimes against humanity are crimes against humanity. Is clear cut. And if someone wants to spin it differently than yourself, it becomes a little bit of a trick for you to somehow engage them as if you need to convince them or get consensus. You need to be more focused on the heart that you're bringing to the subject. You know, what is your sense of motivation? And so with all that's transpired, I can say I don't hate the other side, if you will. I don't hate the white supremacists. I don't hate the Proud Boys or any of them. I see in them human beings that are experiencing extraordinary amounts of pain, disillusionment, and anguish. So there's a level of feeling a sadness for the torment that they have constructed, because the dehumanizing of Black people is not healthy for white people who do it. This whole thing is not healthy for anyone. And so when they're telling you that they feel they're being vaporized, that they're being made invisible, human beings that feel that are in a tortured place, and they will do horrific things. They will go out and shoot people because human beings do that. So I'm not going to dehumanize them either. With that being said, I'm not trying to win them over. The focus is that there are processes in place for managing how politics are conducted, health services are provided, insurance is given. And we have to be mindful that humanity's been taken away from that. So everyone's familiar with the NFL. There's a lawsuit that was filed by an ex-player a couple months back where under the concussion protocol, you're able to go to get that some of the funds of that $1 billion fund set up to address the ill health of former players. Well, this thing has been vetted by the NFL Players Union. It was vetted by the NFL. It was vetted and agreed by highly credentialed medical personnel. That system says that Black players are cognitively lower on the scale than white players. And the amount of money you get is based on the delta between the benchmark and where you test currently. Well, the difference is that the white level is about 8 points higher than Black. So, you know, the NFL's response to the suit so far has been, hey, the players union and the doctors all looked at it, we're not saying anything. But that's a very insidious kind of situation to be in, where you've now institutionalized through healthcare that Black people are cognitively inferior. So our challenge is big, yeah, but you can't shy away from that conversation because someone's feelings may be hurt. You don't bring revenge to the conversation, but you need to be firm, committed, steadfast. And so that's where we are.
Thank you, Wes. James, Kashana?
Sure, I'll jump in and I'll try to be as brief as possible. I think that there's sort of this conflation between fragility and backlash. I think there's systematic backlash to sort of movements that are pushing the needle of change forward. And that's been historic. If we think about, for example, COINTELPRO and the prevention of, for example, a Black Messiah, right? That's what I would say institutional, right? And governmental to a certain degree. And we're still seeing that. especially with sort of the backlash or the policing, right, of social media conversations or planting people, right, within peaceful demonstrations to foment a bit of violence. And I would say that I think that's very different, right, from conversations that you may have with colleagues or coworkers that are uncomfortable with having certain conversations. And I don't think that that burden of education lies on people who are Black. If anything, education and reading more and dealing with your own insecurities or understanding how your privilege is a reality and being upheld by systems of injustice is not my responsibility. But we can have a conversation about the pathway forward. And I think that that's an opportunity for conversation that's actually happening in a lot of places. And that piece of the puzzle is actually personal. And then once you sort of deal with these inner workings of how your privilege is affected by inequities or inequality, and most importantly, discrimination, then we actually can come together to foment change. But the backlash that we're seeing, both, for example, in Ferguson, in North Carolina, in New York City, in California, and even in places like Paris, right, to concerted and organized efforts to dismantle systematic racism is something that needs to change. And I, as a historian, can't speak to the pathway forward, but I do recognize that it's something that needs to be deconstructed in order for, I think, an equitable society to take place. So I look to faculty, alumni, and great people on this panel for us to come up with some ideas for the pathway forward. But I think that that's really the first step before we sort of contend with policing how people deal with white fragility.
Thank you. James, do you want the last word before we cede the floor to Dave?
Sure, I'll be really quick. One is, I think, when you deal with anything, it's not, as Wes said, it's not about what they want, it's about what you need. And if your need is not to necessarily be in that situation, leave. Don't deal with it. The other part is, it's not about you having to be that voice and necessarily always being the one championing the cause. That oftentimes when it comes down to, if there is a situation where it is, oftentimes you might just be like, that was inappropriate. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to say more. I'm not going to be the one who's going to process your whole life and how you got to that point to tell that joke in public. That's up to you. The other thing that I just want to say is what the difference for me was between high school and college. When I was in high school, I played soccer. I'd be the only Black person on the field, including all the parents, anyone else. I would be called the N-word many times. When I got to college, I would be called the N-word. I didn't hear it, but my team would shut down and say, that is inappropriate. It wasn't me, it was them. And that is what the change needs to be. But it's not you. Everyone around you takes it on for you.
Thanks for that, James. That's an amazing way to finish this up, by the way. Thank you to the four of you for doing this. I very much appreciate it, as always. And I just look forward to the day that I can actually be in person with all of you. So Dave, do you want to finish it up? Dave, I think you're on mute.
Thanks, hard unmuting there. This was a powerful conversation, and Gladys, thank you so much for facilitating the discussion, and to James and Kishana, Lisa, and Wes for joining us for this conversation, for sharing your insights, your experiences, your recommendations, and how we can find more opportunity and balance. To all of our alumni and friends in our virtual audience, thank you for attending and participating today. Your active engagement in these conversations with these issues is reflective of Maxwell and our shared interest to be good citizens. One of the issues that came out in today's discussion is the importance of investing in allies, communities, and coalition building, and especially at every stage of the policy process. I think James and all our panelists got this exactly right. When the processes themselves are not representative, that there are not persons of color and people with different lived experiences at every level, not just at the worker level and not just up at the initial supervisory level, but at every level, we in fact are not going to get representative policies or decisions. When we think about the wake of the national tragedies that have taken the lives of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Daniel Prude and Rayshard Brooks, Walter Wallace Jr., and now Dante Wright, conversations about our collective responsibilities and commitment to dialogue and coalition building has to happen. As acclaimed author Ibram Kendi notes, we need an open dialogue to both see individual positions and systems of oppression that privilege some over others, and to find a space to confront a horrible situation and to enter a conversation rather than refusing to have the conversation because it's too difficult. I think Wes really put his finger on this, right? And it's how we see other people and what they're going through. We need to intentionally consider how to move forward into action and strengthen awareness of the many ways that racism manifests itself, especially because racism includes things such as sexism, classism, and many others. The Maxwell School is committed to a rigorous social science education and the development of leaders with a fundamental commitment to strengthening governance and public service everywhere. Our commitment to further building a school that is diverse and representative and focused on an inclusive learning environment reflects our desire to meet the world where it is and strive to make significant contributions that improve equity, access, and justice. The leaders and amazing alums that we've just heard from today are representative of the school's mission and our strategic goals. And your continued engagement and philanthropic support enables us to strive and achieve this ambitious mission and to leave our communities better than we found them. I just want to thank our outstanding information and computing technology team for supporting this event. I want to thank Jess Murray, our Director of Alumni Engagement, the Maxwell Dean's Office team, and again, to our participants. I ask that you please watch your email for additional virtual events this spring and summer, including future opportunities to engage in conversations about important issues intersecting with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you have ideas for future topics or members of our faculty or fellow graduates that you would like to hear from, or other suggestions for further events, please submit them to us at alum@maxwell.syr.edu. Thank you again to all of you for joining us. Be well and stay healthy. Take care.